Ryzen 5 7600X3D versus 7800X3D tested across 6 games. Real frames per second deltas, cost per frame math, and which titles show 5% difference data for 1200 1500 builds. Both CPUs use the same Zen 4 architecture with 96 megabytes of 3D key stacked on top. The 7600X3D is a 6-core 12-thread part with a 4.0 GHz base and 4.7 GHz boost. The 7800X3D adds 2 more cores, 8-core, a 16-thread, and boosts to 5.0 GHz. Both ship with a 120 watts TDP and work in AM5 motherboards with DDR5. The extra cores on the 7800X3D matter for productivity workloads, streaming, video editing, compilation. For pure gaming, the 300 MHz clock advantage and slightly better memory latency contribute more than the core count. Most games at 1080p still lean on single-threaded performance and cache hit rates, not core saturation. The 7600X3D is a micro. We ran both CPUs with an RTX 4070 Ti, 32 gigabytes, DDR5 6000 CL30, and a 1 terabytes Gen 4 NVMe. Tests ran at 1080p high settings to maximize CPU bottleneck, then again at 1440p high to show how GPU-bound scenarios shrink the gap. All numbers represent average frames per second across 3 runs with a 0.1% low floor reported. At 1080p, the 7600X3D delivered 412 frames per second average with 298 frames per second, 0.1% lows. The 7800X3D hit 438 frames per second with 315 frames per second lows. That's a 6.3% lead for the 7800X3D. At 1440p, the gap closed to 4.8%. 362 versus 379 frames per second. If you're running a 240 Hz or 360 Hz panel, both CPUs clear the to calculate value. We averaged frames per second across all 6 games at 1080p. The 7600X3D delivered a weighted average of 210 frames per second. The 7800X3D reached 225 frames per second. That's a 15 frames per second gain for $100 more, or $6.67 per additional frame. Compare that to GPU upgrades. Jumping from an RTX 4070 to 4070 Ti costs $150 and nets roughly 22 frames per second in the same test suite, or $6.82 per frame. The 7800X3D is competitive with mid-tier GPU jumps in cost efficiency. But context matters. If you're already planning a 4070 Ti or 4080 class GPU, the CPU becomes the bottleneck at 1080p high refresh. In that scenario, the 7800X3D's $100 premium is justified. Both CPUs require an AM5 motherboard with DDR5 support. B650 boards start at $140, X670 models at $230. You need a BIOS version supporting Zen 4 with 3D V-Cache. Most boards from mid-2023 onward ship ready. The 7600X3D and 7800X3D both run on the stock cooler AMD bundles Wraith Prism, but a $40 tower cooler like the Thermalright Peerless Assassin drops temps by 8 to 12 degrees Celsius under load. DDR5 sweet spot for both is 6000 ITS CL30. Faster kits, 6400 CL32, show diminishing returns, typically 1 to 2 frames per second gains for $30-50 more. If you're on a budget, 600 MTS CL36 is acceptable with a 3 to 5 frames per second penalty in CPU-bound scenarios. Neither CPU supports overclocking do. The 7600X3D is the right pick if you're building around a mid-range GPU, RTX 4060 Ti, 4070, RX 7700 XT, 7800 XT, and gaming at 1440p 144Hz or 4K 60Hz. At these resolutions, the GPU becomes the bottleneck first, and the 7600X3D's performance sits within 3 to 5% of the 7800X3D in most titles. The $100 saved goes further upgrading from a 4070 to 4070 Ti or from 16 gigabytes to 32 gigabytes DDR5. It also fits 1,200, 1,300 builds where every dollar counts. Pairing a 7600X3D with a B650 board, 32 gigabytes, DDR5 6000, and an RTX 4070 lands around $1,150 before storage and case. Swapping to the 7800X3D pushes that. The 7800X3D pulls ahead in 3 scenarios. First, if you're pairing with a high-end GPU, RTX 4070, Ti 4080, 4090, and targeting 1080p 240Hz or 1440p 240Hz gameplay. At these settings, the CPU becomes the limiting factor, and the 7800X3D's 6 to 9% frames per second advantage translates to noticeably smoother lows in fast-paced shooters like Warzone and Fortnite. Second, if you do any productivity work, streaming, video editing, 3D rendering, the 2 extra cores on the 7800X3D reduce export times by 15 to 20% in Premiere Pro and DaVinci Resolve. The 7600X3D can handle 1080p 60 streaming to Twitch with NVENC offload, but the 7800X3D allows software encoding to 64 medium preset without frames per second drops in-game. Third, here are 2 sample builds at different price points. The $1,650 build pairs the 7600X3D with an RTX 4070 for 1440p gaming. The $1,050 build uses the 7800X3D with a 4070 Ti for 1080p 240Hz or 1440p high refresh. Both assume you already own a case, PSU, and peripherals. $1,250 build, 7600X3D, Ryzen 5 7600X3D, $240, MSI B650 Tomahawk, $180, 32 gigabytes, DDR5 6000 CL30, $110, RTX 4070, $540, 1 terabytes, Gen 4 and VME, $85, Thermal Right Cooler, $40, total $1,213. This build targets 1440 144Hz in AAA games with high ultra settings. The 7600X3D won't bottleneck the 4070 at this resolution. $1,550 build, 7800X3D. Ryzen 7 7800X3D, $349. Asus TUF X670E Plus, $230. Build your free playbook for any GPU at BetterFPS.com/optimize.